So I'd been a local preacher for about 10 or 11 years, and I'd done that training when my girls were quite little. And I'd sort of would preach regularly, but I wasn't somebody that would preach most Sundays because I was also involved in the music at the church. And uh, I think through a lot of that time, I would never have thought I would be here today. It was nothing that I was contemplating. Um, but there was a niggle, and I've heard other people talk about the niggle that there was something else, that there was something else that I should be doing that I wasn't. There's a couple of things that kind of changed. At one point, and I was going into one of my schools, and I crossed the quad, and I'm not somebody that would say they hear a voice of God, a lot. I would say, it's perhaps the one and only time. Um, but I heard a voice very clearly say, "Are you sure you want to be doing this for the rest of your life?" And so at the time, I did begin to explore things a little bit, but somehow, I don't know, the kids were still relatively young. There was I talked myself out of it anyway, and just kept on doing what I was doing. And there was the niggle that was kind of saying, well, maybe there's an adventure out there for you. And it was actually a holiday with some friends. And it always strikes me as interesting how God works through all sorts of people, regardless not of whether they have any sort of professed faith or not. We had some days away with some friends, and I had conversations with one of them that was just saying that, I thought there was something that was missing. And I came away from those few days away thinking, I've got to do something about this. I've got to work out I've got to investigate this a bit more. Through those conversations, so I thought I've got to face this. And it perhaps was there in the back of my head, but I didn't want to acknowledge it. And I thought I've actually got to acknowledge whether or not this is a calling to something else, a calling to go into ministry of some kind. And about the same sort of time, I was down to take a service at a care home that was in our circuit. And I turned up, and as you wait to be let in, I could see a family member sort of pacing the floor the other side. And as soon as I got in, was let in, she explained that her mother was receiving end of life care, and they'd called because they were Church of England, they'd called the parish office, but nobody had come. And would I go and pray with them after I'd finished my service? Afterwards, I was sort of taken up to a room, and I prayed with her. And things like, even though she wasn't having her eyes open or saying anything to anybody, she still joined in with the Lord's Prayer. I prayed with her daughters. And actually, I mean, she lived another couple of weeks, but that sort of taught me that, because if somebody had said, would anybody volunteer to go, I would never have put myself forwards. But I couldn't not say, I could only say yes when being asked. And I guess was shown that God would provide, and God would give me the skills that I needed. Soon after I moved here, I remember it wasn't my first communion that I led, but it was one of the first. It was in that first of term. I was really struck when I was offering communion, and people were offering their hands, and they, how different they were, and how they were old hands and younger hands, and hands that have done hard work. And I could see each of them as sort of Christ's hands. They've been faithful people, and still are faithful people, that have done God's work over the years, and I was serving them and serving Christ in that. And I guess what I've learned I guess it's something that I've always known, but it's knowing that God is really always with you. And I think that was brought home earlier in January when my father passed away, and that I think he knew he was, he'd been in hospital a little bit. I think he knew he was dying, and there was one morning I sat with him and he was saying goodbye, and we never really had conversations about faith or anything like that, and in that moment he looked at me and said, he's always with you, and I said, yes, yeah, I know, Dad, and that's something that I will treasure. That's kind of summed up his life of faith, and he'd had difficult times at various points in his life, and for him to get to 95 and could still say God's always with you, and I know that I couldn't have done what I've been doing without God, because I don't think I would have believed I could do it, but God through other people has shown me that I can.